I still cannot explain how someone got inside our house that day. I have replayed every moment in my head hundreds of times, hoping I missed something obvious. But the more I think about it, the less any of it makes sense. If I had not been there myself, I probably would not believe the story either. It happened on a Friday afternoon during the worst heat wave our city had seen in decades. News stations kept warning everyone to stay indoors because temperatures had broken every previous record. Rolling blackouts were happening everywhere because the power grid could not keep up with the demand, and by early afternoon our neighborhood had completely lost electricity. My parents had already left for work before sunrise, and since both of them held important public positions, I knew they would not be home until well after dark. That left me alone in a house that felt more like an oven than a place to live. I opened every window I could find, hoping even the smallest breeze would cool the rooms, but all that entered was more scorching air. Every exterior door remained locked, and I checked each one twice, because I had always been careful whenever I stayed home alone. The windows all had thick iron security bars built into them, so there was no possible way for anyone to climb inside. After another hour of sweating through my clothes, I gave up trying to stay comfortable and filled the bathtub with cool water. It was the only place that offered any relief. I climbed in, leaned my head back against the edge, closed my eyes, and finally felt my body begin to cool. For the first time all afternoon, I relaxed. Then I heard a creaking sound from somewhere near the living room. At first I ignored it because houses make strange noises during extreme heat, especially with every window standing open. I convinced myself it was only the breeze shifting a door somewhere in the hallway. I settled back into the water and closed my eyes again. Only a few seconds later I heard a footstep. It was slow, heavy, and completely different from the sounds the house had been making all afternoon. I opened my eyes immediately and listened. The silence returned for several seconds before another footstep echoed through the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of a bedroom door slowly opening. Then another door. Whoever was moving through the house was opening rooms one after another as though searching every corner. I climbed out of the bathtub without caring that water splashed across the floor, wrapped a towel around my waist, switched off the bathroom light, and quietly stood behind the door. My breathing had become so loud that I was afraid it would give away my position. I carefully leaned forward just enough to peek into the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, I saw a dark silhouette standing where the sunlight could not reach. I could not make out a face, or even tell whether it was a man or a woman, because the person stayed completely in the shadows. After a few seconds, the figure disappeared into another bedroom, and almost immediately I heard drawers being opened, furniture scraped across the floor, and objects falling. Whoever had entered my house was tearing the rooms apart. My first thought was that it had to be a burglar, but something about the way the person moved felt wrong. Most thieves grab valuables and leave as quickly as possible. This person seemed to be looking for one specific thing. My hands shook as I reached for my phone on the bathroom sink. Calling my parents crossed my mind, but I already knew they would not answer immediately because of work. Instead, I called the police. The dispatcher answered quickly and calmly asked what the emergency was. I whispered that someone had somehow gotten inside my house even though every door was locked. I explained that I was alone, hiding in the bathroom, and could hear someone searching room after room. The dispatcher asked for my address and whether I could see the intruder. I admitted I had only seen a silhouette but knew someone was inside. She told me there was a police post only a few minutes from my estate and instructed me to stay hidden, remain quiet, and avoid confronting the intruder. Before ending the call, she assured me officers were already on their way. Those next few minutes felt endless. I stayed behind the bathroom door while listening to the stranger continue searching the house. Cabinets slammed shut. Closet doors opened. Drawers emptied onto the floor. Every sound seemed closer than the last. Then everything suddenly stopped. The silence was worse. A moment later, I heard slow footsteps approaching the bathroom. Each step made the wooden floor creak. I stared at the doorknob, expecting it to turn. Instead, the footsteps stopped directly outside. Whoever stood there did not move. It felt as though the person was standing perfectly still, listening for my breathing. I covered my mouth with one hand to stop myself from making any sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was convinced it could be heard through the door. Then 3 loud knocks echoed through the front entrance. A deep voice shouted that it was the police and ordered whoever was inside to open the door. Nobody answered. A second later, an enormous crash shook the entire house as officers forced the front door open. The footsteps outside my bathroom disappeared instantly. Several officers rushed through the house, shouting commands while clearing each room. One of them found me still standing behind the bathroom door, wearing nothing but a towel. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. They escorted me into the living room while other officers searched every room, every closet, the attic, and even outside the house. They never found anyone. What they did find made them believe every word I had said. Nearly every room had been destroyed. Drawers had been emptied across the floor. Cabinets stood open. Closets had been searched. Mattresses had been flipped over. My parents' bedroom looked as though someone had spent an hour looking for something hidden inside it. One officer walked through the house several times before stopping near the front entrance. He looked at the lock for a long time before quietly asking another officer to examine it. They whispered to each other before telling me something that made no sense. Every exterior door was still locked from the inside. None of the windows had been forced open, and the iron bars had never been touched. There was no sign that anyone had entered or left the house. About 20 minutes later, my parents arrived. I had never seen them look so frightened. My mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe, while my father walked silently through the destroyed rooms. He did not seem surprised by the mess. Instead, he looked strangely disappointed, almost like someone who had expected this day to come. One of the officers asked him whether he knew of anyone who might have wanted to break into the house. My father hesitated for several seconds before replying that he could not think of anyone. I knew he was lying. The expression on his face gave him away. That night, after the police finally left, I confronted him. I asked him why someone would search every room without stealing anything. I asked him why he looked like he already knew what they were looking for. He stayed silent for so long that I thought he would refuse to answer. Finally, he told me there were some things that were safer left unknown, and that I should never ask him about it again. That answer only made everything worse. A week later, I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night and walked downstairs for a glass of water. As I passed my father's office, I noticed the door was slightly open. He was inside, sitting alone under a desk lamp with several old documents spread across the table. Before I could say anything, he quickly gathered the papers into a metal box and locked it. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, and quietly said that if I valued my life, I should never enter that room again. It was around 5 in the evening, and I was home alone, rearranging my room after finally moving into my older sister's bedroom. She had gotten married a week earlier and moved out, so my mom decided I could have the bigger room instead of the tiny one I had been sleeping in for years. My parents had divorced when I was young, so it had always been just my mom and me in the house. She had already left for her evening shift at work, promising she would not be back until after midnight. I had spent the whole afternoon carrying clothes, books, and furniture across the hallway, and by then, I was almost finished. The only thing left was the old carpet that covered nearly the entire floor. I rolled it up halfway before my foot landed on one section of the floor that sounded completely different from everything else. Instead of the solid thud I expected, it produced a hollow knock that echoed beneath me. I frowned and stepped on it again, thinking maybe I imagined it, but the strange sound came back. Curious, I bent down and tapped the floor with my knuckles several times. Every knock confirmed the same thing. There was empty space underneath. At first, I assumed it was simply a badly repaired section from whoever owned the house before us. The building itself was old, and my mom had often mentioned that the previous owner renovated parts of it before selling it. Still, something about that hollow sound refused to leave my mind. I walked into the storage room, grabbed a hammer from an old toolbox, and returned to the bedroom. I hesitated for a few seconds because I knew my mom would be furious if I damaged the floor, but curiosity won. I chipped away at the cement until cracks spread across the surface. After several minutes of swinging the hammer, pieces of concrete broke away, revealing old wooden planks underneath. They looked much older than the rest of the house. My heartbeat picked up as I struck the wood several times, until it finally splintered open. Through the tiny hole I created, I pointed my phone flashlight inside and immediately froze. There was nothing beneath the wood except darkness and what looked like a large empty space. My curiosity only grew stronger. I widened the hole by breaking away more cement and pulling out the rotten planks. Dust filled the room as chunks of concrete scattered across the floor. About 15 minutes later, I had created an opening large enough for a person to climb through. As I brushed the dust off my shirt, I realized I was staring into what looked like a hidden passage beneath my own bedroom. My stomach tightened as a cold chill ran through my body. I had lived in that house for almost 4 years and never once imagined there was something underneath it. I stood there staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself to leave it alone and wait for my mom, but another part of me refused to walk away. I had always been the type of person who explored abandoned places and old buildings whenever I had the chance. Even though fear crept into every thought, that same curiosity pushed me forward. I grabbed the brightest flashlight we owned, took one deep breath, and lowered myself into the opening, never imagining that decision would completely change my life forever. The narrow staircase beneath the floor was made of old concrete and stretched farther down than I expected. Every step echoed softly around me while the smell of damp earth became stronger. The air felt strangely cool despite the heat outside. Once I reached the bottom, I found myself inside a long tunnel just wide enough for one person to walk through. The walls were rough, almost as if someone had dug them decades earlier before reinforcing them with bricks. I slowly followed the passage, shining my flashlight ahead while trying not to think about how impossible this all seemed. I kept telling myself maybe it was an abandoned storage tunnel or an old basement from before the house was built. That explanation comforted me for about 30 seconds before I realized the tunnel looked far too clean. There were almost no cobwebs. The floor had footprints pressed into the dust, and they did not look old. Someone had been walking there recently. I continued forward for what felt like 5 minutes until the narrow tunnel suddenly opened into a much larger underground room. My flashlight was no longer needed because electric lights hung from the ceiling, filling the area with a dim yellow glow. I stopped so suddenly that I nearly dropped the flashlight. My eyes slowly scanned the room, struggling to understand what I was seeing. There was a bed pushed neatly against one wall with freshly folded blankets. Shelves were filled with books arranged carefully by size. Several canned foods sat stacked beside bottled water, enough to last someone for months. A small table stood in the center of the room with a half-finished meal resting on a plate. Next to it was a ceramic ashtray containing a cigar that had burned out not long before I arrived. Fresh gray ash still rested inside it. My mouth became dry as one terrifying realization settled into my mind. Someone was living underneath my house. I barely breathed as I slowly turned in every direction. Everything looked clean and organized. Nothing appeared abandoned. Whoever owned that underground room cared enough to keep it spotless. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand while I listened to the silence around me. I whispered to myself that I needed to leave immediately. But before I could move, another sound drifted through the tunnel somewhere beyond the room. At first, it was faint enough that I questioned whether I actually heard it. Then it came again. Slow footsteps echoed against the concrete, growing slightly louder with each passing second. Mixed with those footsteps came another sound that instantly made every hair on my body stand up. It was the muffled crying of a young woman. She sounded exhausted, terrified, and desperately weak, as if she had cried for hours without anyone coming to help her. My heart nearly stopped because only 3 weeks earlier, every television station had been covering the disappearance of a 19-year-old college student who vanished while walking home from class. Her mother had appeared on the news almost every night begging anyone with information to come forward. As I stood frozen underground, I realized that desperate crying sounded exactly like someone who had been trapped for a very long time. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. I did not stop to investigate where the footsteps were coming from or who was crying. I quietly backed away from the opening of the room until I reached the narrow tunnel again. Then I turned and sprinted as fast as I could without looking behind me. My shoes slammed against the concrete while my breathing became louder than the pounding of my heart. Halfway back to the staircase, I thought I heard another set of footsteps suddenly speed up somewhere behind me. Whether someone actually heard me or whether fear was playing tricks on my mind, I never found out because I climbed those stairs faster than I ever thought possible. I pulled myself through the opening into my sister's room, grabbed the loose wooden boards, dropped them back over the hole, and quickly rolled the carpet across the damaged floor. It looked terrible, but at least it hid the entrance for the moment. My hands shook so badly that I struggled to unlock my phone. When I finally managed to dial the emergency number, I forced myself to speak slowly even though I could barely breathe. The dispatcher immediately noticed the panic in my voice and asked what had happened. I explained everything from the hidden passage to the underground room, the fresh food, the cigar ash, the lights, the footsteps, and the crying girl. At first there was a brief silence, and I feared they thought I was making everything up. Then I mentioned the possibility that the crying woman might be the college student who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. The dispatcher's tone changed instantly. She told me not to leave the house, not to go back underground, and to stay on the phone until officers arrived. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard multiple police vehicles stopping outside. Officers rushed into the house while I pointed them toward my sister's room. The moment they uncovered the hidden entrance, their expressions changed completely. One officer immediately called for additional units, while another told me to wait outside. The next 40 minutes felt longer than the rest of my life combined. Police officers carrying rifles disappeared underground while more patrol cars surrounded the neighborhood. Then I heard shouting beneath the house, followed by several loud commands ordering someone to get on the ground. Moments later, paramedics emerged, carrying a frightened young woman wrapped in a blanket. Even from a distance, I recognized her face from the missing person posters that had covered almost every street in town. She was alive. She looked weak and terrified, but she was alive. Minutes later, officers dragged a middle-aged man out in handcuffs. He stared silently at the ground without resisting while detectives searched the underground hideout. Later that night, investigators confirmed he had secretly built the underground living space years before the property was sold. He had been entering and leaving through another concealed tunnel that connected to an abandoned drainage system several streets away. That was how he managed to live beneath occupied houses without anyone realizing it. Months later, I was asked to testify in court. The evidence collected beneath my house linked the man to multiple crimes, including the kidnapping of the young woman everyone had been searching for during those 3 desperate weeks. She survived because the police reached her before it was too late. The kidnapper was found guilty on every charge and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. People often tell me I was brave for climbing into that hidden passage, but I've never believed that. I think I was simply curious, and that curiosity accidentally exposed something unimaginably evil hiding beneath the place I called home. We moved out of that house shortly after the trial because neither my mom nor I could ever sleep peacefully there again. My name is Alex, and this was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. I'm 22 years old, and at the time this happened, I was still living with my parents while finishing college. They owned several commercial properties through their real estate business, but I never cared much about that side of their lives because I had my own routine. Every weekday, they left for work a little after 7 in the morning, and every weekday, I locked the front door after they drove away before heading straight back upstairs to sleep. I've never been a morning person, so the quiet hours after they left always belonged to me. It had become such a predictable routine that I never once stopped to think someone else might have noticed it too. That morning began exactly like every other morning. My mother reminded me not to ignore the grocery delivery if it arrived before noon, while my father teased me about sleeping half the day away. I watched them pull out of the driveway, waited until the gate closed behind their SUV, locked every door in the house, checked the windows without really paying attention, and climbed back into bed. I looked at my phone one last time before placing it beside my pillow. It was just after 7:30. I closed my eyes, expecting to wake up a few hours later, completely unaware that 4 strangers were already inside my home. I have no idea how long I had been asleep before I felt something cold resting against my forehead. The sensation was so unnatural that my eyes opened immediately. Before I could move, a calm voice beside my bed instructed me to wake up slowly and remain completely silent if I wanted to stay alive. My vision cleared just enough for me to realize the cold object touching my forehead was the barrel of a handgun. 4 masked men stood around my bed. One held the pistol inches from my face, while another guarded the bedroom door with a shotgun. The remaining 2 quietly searched through my room, opening drawers and cabinets as though they already knew the layout of the house. Every instinct in my body told me to scream, but I could not force any sound out of my throat. The man holding the pistol noticed the panic on my face and calmly explained that making any noise would be the last mistake I ever made. My heart pounded so violently that I could hear it echoing inside my ears. One of the other men picked up my phone from the pillow and slipped it into his pocket before I even thought about reaching for it. Another looked through my closet, checked beneath the bed, and nodded toward the others as if confirming that everything was exactly as expected. None of them looked nervous. They moved through my room with complete confidence, which made me realize they had planned every second of this long before entering our house. I managed to whisper, that they could take whatever money or valuables they wanted because my parents kept cash and expensive electronics downstairs. The man beside me almost laughed before explaining that they had no interest in stealing anything from the house. Hearing that frightened me more than the gun itself, because it meant I was dealing with people who had come for an entirely different reason. They ordered me out of bed and forced me downstairs with the handgun pressed firmly against my back. My legs shook so badly that I nearly collapsed while walking through the hallway. Family photographs covered the walls, showing birthdays, vacations, and ordinary moments that suddenly felt painfully distant. As I looked at those pictures, I honestly believed I might never see my parents again. They led me into the largest room in the house, where we usually watched movies together. A heavy wooden chair had already been pulled into the middle of the room. They forced me into it and secured my wrists behind my back with thick plastic restraints that immediately cut into my skin. My ankles were tied tightly to the chair legs before a cloth was forced into my mouth and secured behind my head. I instinctively struggled against the restraints, causing the chair to scrape loudly across the floor. One of the masked men grabbed the back of my head and calmly explained that if I continued resisting, they would break both of my legs before my parents ever returned home. I stopped fighting immediately because I could hear from his voice that he was not making an empty threat. For several minutes, nobody spoke. One man watched the front of the house through a narrow opening in the curtains, while another slowly walked through each room, checking something on his phone. The remaining two stood nearby waiting. The silence became unbearable because I had no idea whether they intended to kill me or demand money. My thoughts raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. Eventually, one of the masked men removed the cloth from my mouth long enough to ask for my father's mobile number. I told him it was already saved in my phone. He nodded, retrieved the phone from his pocket, and placed a call. The moment my father answered, everything became clear. The masked man calmly informed him that his only child was tied to a chair inside our own house, and that several firearms were pointed directly at me. At first, my father believed it had to be some kind of prank until the man switched the phone to a video call and turned the camera toward me. My father immediately recognized the room behind me and completely broke down. I could hear the fear in his voice as he desperately tried to understand what was happening. The masked man explained that they were not interested in ransom because they wanted something far more valuable. He informed my father that he would be signing over ownership of one of his largest commercial properties before the end of the day. If he refused, delayed, contacted the police, alerted his security team, or attempted anything clever, his only son would die inside the family home. My father kept insisting that there had to be another solution because that property had been in our family for years. But every time he tried to negotiate, one of the masked men would quietly press the handgun against my head while the others recorded everything. I could see the terror on my father's face through the phone screen. My mother eventually joined the call after hearing the conversation, and within seconds she was crying uncontrollably as she begged them not to hurt me. Listening to her break down while I sat helplessly tied to that chair was one of the worst experiences of my life. I wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, but I could barely hold back my own tears. The men ended the call after making it clear that they were watching both of my parents. They explained that people outside would report every movement they made from the moment they left their office until the documents were signed. If anyone in law enforcement appeared anywhere near them or our house, they would receive a message immediately, and I would be executed before the police even entered the neighborhood. Judging from how calm they remained, I believed every word they said. They had obviously spent weeks planning this operation. They knew our routines, knew my parents' business, knew the layout of the house, and even knew exactly when I would be asleep. The next several hours felt endless. They never raised their voices or acted impatiently. One of them casually helped himself to bottled water from our refrigerator, while another watched the news on television. Every 20 or 30 minutes, someone's phone vibrated with another update. After reading each message, they simply nodded to one another before returning to their positions. The ordinary way they behaved inside our home somehow made everything even more disturbing. They acted like professionals completing another routine assignment, rather than criminals holding someone's child hostage. Sometime after noon, another message finally arrived. The man reading it smiled beneath his mask before announcing that the documents had been signed and ownership had officially changed hands. My parents had surrendered one of the most valuable properties they owned because they believed they would never see me alive again if they refused. The atmosphere inside the room changed immediately. The men gathered everything they had brought with them. They carefully wiped every surface they had touched, collected every bottle, every piece of plastic, every scrap of paper, and left nothing behind that might identify them. Before leaving, the man who had spent the most time watching me walked over and explained that I had never been the real target. According to him, I had simply been the pressure needed to force my parents into making a decision they would never have made willingly. A few moments later, they walked out through the front door, leaving me alone in complete silence. I remained frozen because I genuinely believed someone might still be hiding inside the house, waiting to see if I moved. After several long minutes, I began rocking the chair from side to side until it tipped over onto the hardwood floor. The impact cracked one of the chair legs, creating a sharp edge that I desperately rubbed against the plastic restraint around my wrists until it finally snapped. Once my hands were free, I untied my legs and ran through every room in the house searching for the men, but they had disappeared without leaving the slightest trace that they had ever been there. Less than 20 minutes later, my parents came racing through the front gate. My mother reached me first and held onto me so tightly that neither of us could stop crying. My father stood beside us, looking like he had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. Later that evening, he admitted that he had signed every document placed in front of him, because every few minutes the kidnappers sent live video proving I was still alive with a gun pointed at my head. He knew he was being manipulated, but he also knew that no piece of property was worth gambling with his son's life. The police investigated for months. They discovered that the security cameras around our neighborhood had been disabled shortly before my parents left for work. The ownership documents had been transferred through layers of forged identities and shell companies before disappearing overseas. None of the fingerprints collected inside our home matched anyone in the national database. Despite countless interviews and months of investigation, nobody was ever arrested. We moved away not long afterward, but leaving that house did not leave the memories behind.